Hello and welcome to a full recording of The Mimic Story from Tales from the Pizzaplex. Scott Cawthon, please do not sue me. Let's begin.
Dad, I'm a ghost.
Edwin Murray, his brow in its usual deep furrow, swore when his son's small but insistent hand tugged at Edwin's flannel shirt sleeve. The motion forced Edwin to give up on the intricate wiring job he was attempting. "Stop that, David," Edwin snapped. Edwin looked down, expecting to see the badly cut thatch of David's fine brown hair. Instead, Edwin found himself looking at yellowing lace. The lace was draped over the brown hair, and the rest of David as well. The fragile mesh fabric was undulating and moaning, or rather, the 4-year-old under the fabric was moaning, in a pretty decent approximation of a scary ghost. At the end of the undulating lamentation, however, the lace, actually the boy, sneezed, and then it coughed. The lace churned as if about to erupt. "That's what you get for playing with dusty old lace," Edwin said, his annoyance ebbing a bit. He had to admit that he enjoyed David's creativity, and watching the lace thrash was amusing. Edwin just hoped the boy wasn't picking up some noxious disease from that ancient fabric. It was early March, and spring rain was seeping in through a few of the cracks in the factory's old brick walls and dripping down from a couple leaks in the tin roof. The water from those leaks collected on the 3rd floor, but the moisture pervaded the entire building, and although the factory had dozens of tall, skinny-paned windows, several were boarded up, and the thick glass panes of most of the rest had been painted gray. When he'd bought this building, Edwin had painstakingly scraped the paint off all the 2nd-floor windows so the living space would have some light. But he'd left the lower windows painted over. He liked the privacy, even though the lack of light made the expensive space damp and musty. Edwin was already concerned that David was going to catch a bad cold, as he had the past 2 springs. He didn't relish the idea of adding the potential bugs and bacteria lingering on the lace into the mix. When Edwin bought the abandoned factory to house his new business, he'd found yards and yards of knotted, crumbling lace throughout the building. The lace was piled against the factory's brick walls, strewn across its rough cement floors, mounded beneath the lever's machine and the main production room, and even wrapped around its dozens of concrete support pillars. The lace was sprinkled with the pillars' pale green peeling paint. Edwin wasn't sure why the factory's owners had left such an intricate work behind. However, Edwin rather liked the lace. Although some of it had mildewed, he thought much of it might be salvageable, and he was sure his creative mind could come up with some use for it. So he had left it where it was. His wife, Fiona, had liked it, too. 5 years before, when Edwin had acquired the building, he and Fiona had also just purchased the old Queen Anne mansion they'd planned to restore to its original grandeur. Fiona had been delighted by all the lace in the old factory because she'd envisioned using it to make
Yards and yards of luscious window coverings. And a canopy for our bed, my love.
she'd added, winking at Edwin. Edwin had blushed. Back then. And it now seemed so long ago. Edwin had been a deliriously happy man. After Fiona had died giving birth to David, Edwin had been tempted to get rid of all the lace. He hadn't wanted to trigger memories of a time that was forever lost to him. However, throwing it out felt like just another loss. He couldn't bear to do it. And so the lace remained, and so did the memories. The lacy ghost sneezed again. Edwin reached down and pulled the dusty fabric off his son. His impish, freckled face revealed. David grinned, sneezed once more, and wiped his nose so hard it was a miracle that the up-tilted snout remained on the boy's face at all. "I thought you were going to play with your toys while I worked," Edwin said, doing his best to sound stern. "We had an agreement, remember? You play quietly for an hour, Daddy gets work done, and then we go for ice cream."
Ice cream!
David shouted.
Chocolate chip ice cream!
David, who was clutching a plush white tiger in his left hand, grabbed the lace again with his right. He threw the lace over his shoulders like a cape and began dancing around.
Chocolate chip! Chocolate chip! Chocolate chip!
He turned the words into a part chant, part song. Edwin crossed his arms and studied his son, as he often did. Edwin looked for some evidence of his own looks in the little boy. He never found any, beyond a similar slope to their eyes. Edwin was happy that David looked more like Fiona than Edwin. Fiona had been far lovelier than he was, as he often told her. Edwin had never understood what Fiona had seen in him. Whenever he'd asked her, she'd tweak the full sandy brown mustache that Edwin had worn since his junior year in high school.
I fell for your mustache,
Fiona would tease. Then she'd giggle and give him a big kiss. And he would forget to care about why she loved him. He was just so happy that she did. David's song grew louder, and it picked up some percussion. He'd taken up a wooden slat from the old levers machine and used the stick to pound on the cement floor in time to his chant. Edwin shook his head. Ice cream was the last thing David needed. The boy was already worked up. In fact, he was nearly always worked up. Edwin remembered how excited he'd been when he learned he was going to be a father. He already had a job he loved, a gorgeous wife he adored, who inexplicably adored him back, and enough money to buy what he and his wife wanted. Now he'd have a child, too. He'd have a legacy, someone to pass his life's work on to. For nearly all of Edwin's 24 years, he'd loved building things. When he'd been about David's age, he'd begun taking apart his mother's small appliances to see how they worked, though they rarely still worked when he put them back together. His mother was amazingly tolerant of the need to frequently replace things. By the time Edwin was 8, he knew that he wanted to build useful machines that would change people's lives. He believed in automating life's most mundane tasks, and he was sure he could create robots to replace most of the household chores people didn't want to do. He got his first patent on a robotic vacuum cleaner when he was still a college student. Despite the bugs and high price point, it had sold well enough to allow Edwin to start his business right out of school. The vacuum also funded a good life for Edwin and Fiona, who had met at school and married as soon as they graduated. The vacuum was wildly popular, at first. Unfortunately, the machines didn't have the longevity the customers expected, and complaints began rolling in. Eventually, sales fell off. Edwin watched his son cavort around in front of the metal garment rack that held a circus-like array of animal and other character costumes, and imagined, for at least the 1000th time, how different things would have been if Fiona had lived. If she survived giving birth to David, Edwin wouldn't have been derailed by grief, and he wouldn't have had to try to figure out how to invent his machines and take care of his infant son at the same time. David Sean Murray, now attempting to do a somersault while still wrapped in lace, had come into the world just before dawn on a stormy fall morning, and he'd arrived in full screaming fury. Given that Fiona had been bleeding to death as David caterwauled, Edwin assumed that David's protest against being taken from his mother's womb had been amplified by the understanding, on some unfathomable mother-son bonding level, that he was about to lose his mother for good. Or maybe Edwin was being fanciful. Maybe David was just a noisy baby. Whatever the reason, David's vocal protestations didn't end on that day. They continued on and on. Edwin had spent the next several weeks trying to function on an hour or two of sleep, if he was lucky, per night. Instead of being able to throw himself into his work and either fix the vacuum or come up with something even better, Edwin had to spend the better part of his days feeding David, burping David, rocking David, changing David's diapers, and listening to David cry and cry and cry. Edwin loved his son. He really did. But without Fiona, Edwin was a man hanging on to a cliff's edge by the tips of his fingernails. He wasn't sure he could do what he needed to do. 4 years had passed, and he still wasn't sure. David's chocolate chip chant was getting louder and louder. The boy was spinning faster and faster. "David!" Edwin shouted. David stopped spinning, but the momentum sent him staggering across the cement floor. He careened into Edwin's work table, knocking over the animatronic head that Edwin had been wiring. The head, that of a bright yellow chick, rolled across the table and fell to the cement floor. A spark shot out of the chick's eye. "David!" Edwin yelled even louder. "That's enough!" David had lost his balance entirely and landed on his rump. The boy's dark brown eyes blinked twice. Then, David severely arched his eyebrows. He buried his face in his tiger, and he started to cry. Edwin sighed and picked up his son. "Come on," Edwin said. "I think you need a nap." David, remarkably big for his age, in spite of having two short parents, wasn't an easy carry. He weighed close to 50 pounds, and he was 3.5 feet tall. Pretty soon, Edwin, only 5'5" himself, wasn't going to be able to cart his son around. Perhaps he should build a robot to do that for him. Edwin's steps faltered. "That's not a bad idea," he said to himself. "He's going to make the mimic." It was difficult. David stopped his crying mid-gulp and looked up.
What's a bad idea, Daddy?
"No, not a bad idea," Edwin attempted to clarify. "Just not a bad idea, which means a good idea." David twisted his nose and pursed his full, small lips. Edwin didn't blame the boy for his confusion. "Never mind," Edwin said. "How about I read you a story and you take a short nap, and then we'll get some ice cream." David stuck a stubby index finger in his mouth and sucked on it while he pondered the proposal. Finally, he nodded. "Good boy," Edwin said. He'd reached the top of the cement stairs that led to the second floor of the building. He put David on his feet, took the boy's hand, and led him down a wide hall to what used to be part of the factory's office and storage space. After Fiona had passed away, Edwin had known he couldn't manage a house and his business property at the same time, and since the factory was where Edwin did his work, the choice of which to keep was an easy one. Thankfully, Edwin was an engineer/architect, so he converted parts of the factory's offices to a small apartment with a compact sitting area, a tiny galley kitchen, 1 bedroom and 1 bathroom, with an old clawfoot tub. All the little rooms, except the kitchen, which was floored with blue linoleum, now had wall-to-wall brown carpet, chosen to hide the dirt. All the apartment's exterior brick walls and interior white-painted walls were decorated with an electric mix of David's artwork, aka scribbled drawings, and old photographs. In the factory's offices, Edwin had found dozens of black and white photos of the factory in its heyday. As David grew older, Edwin would have to create a second bedroom. But for now, keeping an eye on David was easier when they slept in the same room. Not that they slept there very often. Much of the time, Edwin worked on the factory's main level at night, and David slept on a cot nearby. Edwin knew that this wasn't the ideal setting for raising a child. There were hundreds of ways a child could get injured in the 5,000-square-foot building. David, though, in spite of his penchant for noisy tantrums, was a good kid. He hadn't defied Edwin's orders to stay away from the machines, yet Edwin had noticed that David was getting a little bolder in his adventures. That might become a problem as he got older. And that was what made the idea Edwin had just such a brilliant idea. But would he have time to implement it?
Daddy?
Edwin was peripherally aware that David was climbing onto his small mattress, which was nestled inside a wooden white tiger's head. The head, which Edwin had carved to mimic the look of David's favorite toy, arched up and over the top of the mattress. David loved the tiger bed almost as much as his plush tiger, named, appropriately, Tiger.
Daddy!
Edwin, who had been contemplating the notion of mimicking... Alright, sorry, I'm done. Blinked and frowned at his son. who was now standing on the mattress, holding up said plush tiger. "What is it, David?" Edwin sighed and pointed at the mattress. "Lie down." David obliged, but he kept holding up his plush friend.
Tiger wants to know if he can have ice cream too. Chocolate chip.
"Of course. What other flavor is there?" David giggled.
So he can have some?
Edwin stroked his mustache. "I suppose we could ask Lucy to get some of the special invisible tiger ice cream made just for tigers out of the back for him when we get to the ice cream place."
Lucy's nice,
David said. "Yes, she is." David liked the grandmotherly woman who owned the ice cream parlor so much that Edwin had a feeling David's love of ice cream was more related to a desire to see Lucy than it was about eating the ice cream itself. "But you won't see Lucy unless you and Tiger take a nap." David growled.
That's what Tiger says about naps.
"Very wise," Edwin said. David leaned over and rooted around in a mess of books that were scattered over the floor by his bed. Edwin looked at his watch. His shoulders tightened. David?" David's head popped up. His eyes were bright and eager. Edwin felt like a jerk for what he was about to say. "How about we skip the story?" Edwin asked. The bright eyes dimmed. A quiver appeared around the dimple in David's chin. "Just for now," Edwin said. "I'll read 2 stories before you go to bed tonight. But if Daddy's going to be able to take you for ice cream, he has to get some work done." David pushed out his lower lip. Then, remarkably, he shrugged.
Okay, Daddy.
David flopped onto his stomach and tucked Tiger up against his chest. He closed his eyes, and within seconds his breathing slowed. David might have been a noisy, almost hyperactive child, but he had some wonderful qualities. Not only did he listen pretty well, but he could also fall asleep nearly instantly. If only Edwin could learn that skill. Edwin lightly smoothed David's silky soft hair. David stirred, then his breathing slowed even more. Edwin headed back down to the main floor of the factory. He had so much work to do, and he might just get a half hour of uninterrupted concentration. One of the old exposed pipes that crisscrossed the ceiling on the factory's first level clunked. Edwin could hear David's voice in his head.
It's the pipe fairy.
David had names for all the sounds the factory made. He'd named its distinctive features as well. Although the factory was dark, filled with old debris, and dirtier than it should have been, David wasn't scared by it. To David, the factory was home. He'd made friends with it. More than one visitor to Edwin's business had expressed concern about David's safety in the large, old building that sat at the edge of the 4-lane highway that ran through the industrial part of town. The land that the old factory sat on wasn't much bigger than the factory itself, so David had no yard to play in, and their only lawn was a vacant gravel lot. Sometimes they'd play catch there, or they'd sit in folding chairs and play Name That Car. Edwin would teach David about cars they spotted on the highway. David had an amazing memory and was learning quickly. Recently, Fitz, the delivery man who brought Edwin all his current projects and the supplies he ordered, had asked, "Don't you worry about the kid falling down the stairs or getting hurt in the machines or locked into a room or something?" Edwin looked up from the clipboard. "What?" He noted that Fitz was looking past his shoulder toward the levers machine that dominated the east wall of the main factory floor. Edwin turned to look at the mammoth lace-making machine. It was dark and silent. None of its thousands of moving parts could so much as twitch now. As far as Edwin knew, it had been frozen in place for over 30 years. The machine had been turned off mid-job, and now a moth-hole-riddled expanse of lace hung loosely over the machine's beam roller. Limp, yellowed threads stretched like spiderwebs from spools stacked on a nearby bobbin-winding unit. "Oh, he knows better than to go near that," Edwin said. He felt a need to reassure Fitz, so he continued. "All the extra rooms are closed up, and I usually help him with the stairs. I built him a slide for coming down, you see."
You built your kid an indoor slide?
Fitz raised his bushy black eyebrows and he looked back at the clipboard. Yep, Edwin said. It had been fun. Edwin had found a second-hand slide that had once been in an amusement park, and he'd bolted it to one wall of the secondary stairs between the first and second floor. He'd placed a couple mattresses at the bottom of the slide. David loved the thing. Sometimes he loved it too much. He frequently demanded that Edwin carry him up the sharply canted stairs over and over so he could slide down it repeatedly. Edwin returned to his work table and frowned at the yellow chick head lying near one of the table's legs. He sighed. He really had no interest in continuing the project, but he had to. Edwin bent over and picked up the chick's head. He sighed again. It occurred to him that he sighed a lot, but why shouldn't he? Edwin was trapped in a life he didn't want to live, and he was doing projects he never in a million years thought he'd be working on. He was turning weird creature costumes into entertainment robots, for heaven's sake. What was useful about that? Edwin set the metal chick head down on the table in front of him. This was the 18th animatronic character he'd been asked to create. He spent the last year and a half abandoning his own work to bow to another company's agenda. Edwin thought back to the day he signed away his own enterprise.
You're doing the right thing,
Grant Sterling, the portly Fazbear Entertainment executive who negotiated the buyout, said as he watched Edwin scrawl his signature on the bottom of the 12-page contract. Am I? Edwin had wondered. When Edwin had started his company, he thought his timing was perfect. It was the early 70s. People wanted more time to play, and their minds were opening as well. Edwin had assumed these things would translate into a huge market for his machines. Unfortunately, he'd been wrong. Either that or his personal tragedies had undermined his ability to create machines that were good enough to attract a big market share. The machines he designed were intricate and required thousands of hours of focused work, not to mention very expensive parts and tools. Raising a son on his own had pulled the rug right out from under Edwin. He just hadn't had enough in him to do everything he needed to do. When his finances ran out, he had no choice but to sell his company to Fazbear Enterprises.
You have a real talent, Grant said. We're happy to welcome you to the Fazbear family.
Edwin turned over the chick head. He pressed his lips together in disgust. The fall to the floor had dented the chick head's beak and snapped off one of the metal feathers atop its head. Great, Edwin muttered. He was behind schedule and totally overwhelmed. He didn't have time to take David to get the promised ice cream today, or any other day for that matter. But he'd have to do it. David would throw a tantrum to end all tantrums if Edwin didn't keep his promise. Edwin contemplated the chick's head. He really had to get to work on it, but a new idea was leaping around in his mind. It was demanding attention, and rightfully so. If Edwin could pull off what he had in mind, it would open up an enormous amount of time for him. David would be entertained, and Edwin would be free to concentrate on his work. Edwin pushed aside the chick's head. He grabbed his drafting pad and a pencil. It put him 3 weeks behind in his projects for Fazbear Entertainment, but Edwin, working feverishly and essentially giving up sleep entirely for many bleary-eyed days, was able to take his idea from spark to completion in an amazingly short amount of time. Edwin attributed this speed to the passion he held for this particular project. Edwin had been so caught up with Fazbear that he'd forgotten what it was like to pour himself into his own creations. He felt like he'd been gasping for air for months, and now he could finally breathe again.
What you building?
David had asked the first day that Edwin had begun implementing the plan he'd sketched out. I'm building you your new toy, Edwin had said.
What kind of toy?
One that will keep you company while I work, Edwin had said. David had twisted his lips into his "I don't understand" expression. "I'm building you a friend," Edwin clarified.
The tiger's my friend.
David held up the white tiger. The tiger wasn't all that white today. David had taken the tiger on an adventure behind the stacks of spools. The area had decades of accumulated dirt, and much of it now smudged the tiger's fur. "Well, once I finish what I'm building, you and Tiger will have another friend," Edwin said. "Now why don't we take Tiger upstairs and clean him up, then we can have some dinner."
Mac and cheese,
David screamed. As Edwin had helped David climb the sharp flight of stairs, Edwin's chest had tightened at the thought of his son having just a plush tiger, and soon a robotic torso for a friend. Next year that would change. Edwin would be able to put David into kindergarten. Even though he'd relish the time to himself, Edwin didn't have the money to pay for preschool, and the free class was across town. Besides, the one time he tried to enroll David in a community program, too many busybodies had started sticking their noses into his business. David apparently told some hair-raising stories about sleeping in an abandoned factory that groaned and clanked all night. No. For now, David was better off with Edwin. And if Edwin's idea worked, Edwin could keep his son close and have time to work. Edwin didn't have a lot of money for supplies to build what he wanted to build, so he'd come up with a design that would allow him to cannibalize other machinery in the factory. By pulling wiring from rooms he never even used, taking pistons from defunct industrial washing machines, and borrowing steel and spools and gears and springs from the lever's machine, Edwin had fashioned the torso, arms, and head of a primitive-looking endoskeleton. This physical housing was the easy part. Once Edwin had constructed the legless robot, he had began to build the computer for it. This he did by stealing hardware from some of his abandoned projects. Now came the challenging part. Edwin wanted to create a thinking mind that would learn by mimicking what it observed. It had been Edwin's observation of how the bed he'd built for David mimicked David's favorite toy that had given him the idea. Thinking about the concept of mimicking so soon after casually contemplating having a robot to entertain his child had brought the whole idea together. Perhaps because the idea was inspired, or perhaps because Edwin was so desperate to find a way to take care of David without actually having to take care of David, Edwin was able to write the code for the program at nearly the speed of light. It was like the program wanted to be written, so it helped him to create it. He used a combination of Pascal and C to write his code. What he did was unusual, and some might have called it slapdash as he hurried to get the robot finished. He took several shortcuts that any other programmer would have frowned upon, but he was happy with the result. David was happy too. After 22 days of feverish work, Edwin was about to boot up his creation for the first time when David and Tiger zipped down the back staircase slide and trotted over to Edwin. David charged up to Edwin and leaned against his dad's leg. David wrinkled his nose.
You stink,
he announced. Thank you for pointing that out, Edwin said. His son was right. Between taking care of David and building his brainchild, Edwin had let a few things fall by the wayside. Personal hygiene was one of those. His breath, he suddenly realized, was stale, and his armpits might have been lethal. But none of that mattered. It was done. Check this out, Edwin said to David. Lifting the endoskeleton off the table, Edwin set it on the floor in front of David. Then, Edwin sat down, cross-legged next to it. David plopped down next to his dad.
What's its name?
David asked, studying the endoskeleton's face. Edwin also looked at his creation's face, wondering how a 4-year-old boy would see it. He glanced at David as he realized the endoskeleton's features might have been a bit scary for a little kid. Given what Edwin had been able to work with, he thought the endoskeleton's head had turned out pretty well. Edwin's first attempt to form the skull had started with simply placing 2 large white doll's eyes within the boxy confines of a piece of metal housing he'd scrounged from the broken-down compressor. Because the square top looked nothing like the real head, though, Edwin had tried again. He'd found a rounded bit of metal in the guts of the lever's machine and used it to form a narrow protuberance that jutted up from between the big white eyes. Under the eye housing, Edwin had welded in place a hinged jaw that he formed out of parts of the lever's machine guide bars. Using a set of novelty chattering teeth he'd found in a box full of old bits and bobs on the floor, Edwin had given his creation a big white-toothed mouth. Getting all this hardware connected to its programming required welding a large processor to the back of the skull and running a tangle of wires all down the skull. Wires stretched toward the back of the skull and dove in and out of both eye sockets, snaked through the mouth, and extended down the articulated neck that in turn connected with the metallic spine, which connected with a makeshift rib cage that was not as curved as Edward had wanted it to be. But it worked, and the rib cage was linked to two robotic arms that ended in pincer-like hands. Okay, so maybe the thing wasn't pretty. In fact, its appearance was a tad bit disturbing. David, however, didn't look scared. His eyes were sparkling, and his head was cocked into what looked like curiosity rather than trepidation. "I haven't given it a name," Edwin said. He thought about the program he'd written. He called the program Mimic 1. Well, that would work. "How about Mimic?" he suggested. David made a face.
That's a weird name.
Edwin had no response to that comment.
But I like it.
David continued.
Mimic.
He nodded.
Yeah, that's okay.
"Glad you approve," Edwin said. David shifted position and frowned.
What does it do?
David asked. "Well, let's find out," Edwin said. Taking a deep breath, Edwin reached behind Mimic's neck and activated it. The Mimic's eyes lit up. They fluttered. Its mouth opened and closed. David leaned forward, rapt. In slow motion, the Mimic leaned forward. Startled, David whipped his head back and hugged Tiger, but he giggled. Mimic, still moving slowly, pulled its head back and pantomimed hugging a tiger-sized invisible object. David giggled again.
He's copying me,
David said, clearly delighted. Edwin smiled. He sure was. Mimic was working. David put out a finger and touched Mimic's chest. Mimic put out a pincer and touched David's chest. David sat down Tiger.
Want to play patty cake?
David asked his new friend. Edwin blinked in surprise. He'd played the clapping game with David when David was much younger, but they hadn't played in a couple years. David, however, clearly remembered the game. On some level, apparently understanding that he had to show Mimic what to do, David clapped his hands slowly and then put his hands out, fingertips up, palms toward the Mimic. Mimic matched the movements as best he could, his spread, pincer-like fingers to approximate David's hand position. David clapped again. Mimic brought the pincers together with a small metal clink. Edwin closed his eyes and rolled his shoulders. He'd done it. Now he could get back to his work and his paying jobs. But first he had to clean himself up. Edwin opened his eyes and looked at David, who was still teaching a complex version of patty cake to his new friend. David, Edwin said, how about we take Mimic upstairs and you two can play while I take a shower? David stopped playing. He dropped his hands. Mimic did the same.
That's good,
David said.
You need soap.
He pointed at Edwin, then put his fingers over his nose. Edwin laughed as Mimic moved his pincers to the space that separated its eyes.
Mimic agrees,
David said. Edwin laughed harder and stood. He leaned over and picked up Mimic as David jumped to his feet. David took Edwin's free hand.
I like Mimic,
David said. Mimic reached out and wrapped his pincers around Edwin's wrist. The feel of the cold metal against Edwin's skin made Edwin stiffen for a minute. Some primitive part of his brain felt a surge of fear. Would Mimic clamp down and hurt Edwin? No, the Mimic's touch was gentle. even hesitant. Edwin relaxed and took his son and his son's new friend up the stairs. The next 2 weeks were the best Edwin could remember having since Fiona had died. After catching up on some sleep the first night Mimic was completed, Edwin woke up energized and ready to create characters for Fazbear Entertainment. And because David was occupied with his new friend, Edwin had long stretches of uninterrupted work time. It was fantastic. It was amazing how much he could get done when he wasn't being interrupted every other minute. When Edwin had programmed Mimic, he hadn't had the parts he needed to give Mimic the ability to speak. He'd been concerned that this would be a problem for David. But he shouldn't have worried. David had no issue with Mimic's muteness. He started developing a sort of sign language to communicate with the Mimic. David's sign language involved often hilarious imitations of things he was trying to communicate. Ice cream, for example, was communicated with a gesture that involved turning one hand into a bowl-like shape and using the other hand to approximate the shape of a spoon. David would dip the spoon into the imaginary bowl and then put it to his lips. Then, in what Edwin thought was adorably brilliant, David would rub the front of his chin as if ice cream was dripping there. Mimic copied every move David made, and this encouraged David to teach Mimic more and more things. At first, what Mimic could do was somewhat limited. He could slowly copy David's simpler movements. It was impressive for a robot held together with the engineering equivalent of 2 pieces of tape, but it wasn't a replacement for a real friend. So, Edwin tinkered with Mimic to make sure that David wouldn't get bored. Edwin wanted Mimic to be able to move as smoothly as possible. He still wasn't sure how Mimic was learning so quickly, but he was very pleased by this development. Edwin was even starting to kick around ideas for how he could use the evolving program to get his company back. The Mimic 1 program, if it matured as Edwin hoped it would, could be applied to many tasks. The first time Edwin realized he hadn't checked on David for hours, he was shocked. It felt irresponsible, almost. For all he'd known, David could have left the building. But he hadn't. When Edwin looked up from finally finishing the giant chick robot that he'd been working on, he found David and Mimic on the floor coloring. Mimic was actually using crayons. Mimic's use of the crayons was clumsy, and he definitely didn't color inside the lines, but David didn't either. David had always been prone to coloring the entire page, so Mimic did that too. Later that same day, Edwin's concentration was broken by a rhythmic thwacking sound. At first, the sound was just enough to make him frown, but as it got louder and was joined by David's giggles, Edwin grumbled and looked around. A few feet from his work table, Edwin spotted David and Mimic tossing a red rubber ball back and forth. Because David wasn't all that good at throwing or catching a ball, the ball frequently missed its target and bounced across the floor. Undaunted, David scampered after it, retrieved it, and tried again. Mimic's throws, because they were a copy of David's, were just as inconsistent, but David was clearly delighted by the clumsy game of catch. Edwin smiled. Although the noise was distracting, at least David was content. Edwin returned to his work, satisfied that Mimic was doing what Edwin had designed it to do. Mimic went everywhere that David went. He sat at the table when David ate, he perched at the edge of the sink when David brushed his teeth, and all the while he copied David's motions. One evening, as they ate, David pushed his bowl of mac and cheese across the table so it was in front of Mimic. Mimic immediately took the spoon and scooped up some of the noodles. Edwin had to scramble to stop Mimic from drooping the mac and cheese throughout its open mouth. It wasn't as if the food would hurt Mimic. It would have gone through the novelty teeth and out the back opening behind them, tumbling down the back of the Mimic's neck. But Edwin didn't want to scrub cheese off of the Mimic. "Whoa there," Edwin said. "I'm afraid you're not designed to digest food." He was taking a sip of milk, and he laughed so hard that the milk came out of his nose. Mimic opened his mouth and approximated the head-shaking, open-mouthed action of a laugh. David laughed even harder, then he jumped up and said to Mimic, "Let's play trains." Edwin put his hand out in a stop gesture and shook his head. What do you do first? David looked up to the right and twisted his lips. Then he giggled.
Sorry, Daddy.
He turned to pick up the carton of milk sitting next to his plastic cup. Always put things away in the fridge, he said. Using 2 hands, David carefully carried the quart carton to the fridge and stowed it away. Mimic watched his every move. Because David always carried the tiger, Mimic usually had one of his arms curved in a way that suggested an invisible tiger. One day, David decided Mimic needed his own tiger.
Can we buy Mimic a tiger?
David asked Edwin just before bedtime. Edwin looked at Mimic's inwardly curved arm. The gesture tugged at his heartstrings. But he shook his head. Sorry, sport, he said, but money's a little tight right now. David had heard this often enough that he knew what it meant. He shrugged.
Okay.
Later that day, when Edwin had finished up the programming on a Pirate Fox character, he looked around and spotted David and Mimic by a pile of lace near the lever's machine. Both were bent over the lace, folding and unfolding it. Edwin got up and walked over to his son. What are you doing? He asked. David looked up and grinned. Then he looked at Mimic.
Is it ready?
He asked Mimic. Mimic nodded. Edwin's brows rose. This wasn't mimicking. It was responding. When had that happened? David leaned back and pointed at Mimic. Mimic opened his mouth in his version of a smile. Edwin blinked in amazement. Cradled in the curve of Mimic's left arm was an approximation of a tiger. It was made of lace and held together with string. David and Mimic had used the old material to form a head, body, and 2 arms, and 2 legs. They'd even managed to create little nubbins atop the head that looked like tiger ears.
Now Mimic has a tiger too,
David said triumphantly. Edwin reached down and ruffled David's hair. Yes, he does. Very well done. Very clever. David beamed. Mimic's eyes lit up brighter than usual. Now even more confident that he could leave David in Mimic's care, Edwin threw himself into his work. He put in long hours, stopping only to feed David or answer David's occasional questions. The questions, however, weren't as occasional as Edwin would have preferred. Although Mimic could entertain David in many ways, the robot couldn't talk to the boy.
Why do we have to brush our teeth?
David asked one day when Edwin was trying to rush David through his morning routine. Because if we don't, we get cavities, Edwin said.
What are cavites?
David asked. Cavities, Edwin enunciated. David repeated the word, correctly this time.
What are they?
Holes in the teeth. David looked alarmed.
I can get holes in my teeth?
He pointed at the Mimic.
He doesn't brush. Won't he get holes in his?
David had stopped brushing, and he waved his toothbrush, toothpaste, and water flew everywhere, including onto the clean shirt Edwin had just managed to get on his son. Keeping himself and David in clean clothes was always a challenge. Edwin had no washer or dryer in the factory. This was on his list of improvements to add once he got more money, but for now he had to go to a laundromat, and he hated going to the laundromat. Stop that, Edwin said. He shook a finger at his son. Don't be careless. David's face screwed up. His lower lip quivered. Don't you dare start crying, Edwin snapped. Of course, the command had the exact opposite effect of what Edwin wanted. David started crying. Turning away from Edwin, David hunched over. Mimic, perched by the sink, hunched over as well. Edwin grabbed David by the shoulders and shook him. David's cries turned into screams of rage. Oh, for heaven's sake, Edwin said. He forced himself to take a deep breath. He knew better than to do what he'd just done. It was just that he had so much work to do, and he only wanted David to brush his teeth and sit and go play with Mimic. Was that too much to ask? Edwin crouched down in front of his son. David, I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry, I yelled. David wasn't in a forgiving mood. He turned away from Edwin and reached for the mimic. Mimic wrapped his pincer hands around David's fingers. Edwin spent the next several minutes trying to calm David down. The whole time he promised himself he'd do better by his son. But he didn't. His resolve fled within a mere 10 minutes after the incident. By then, David was wearing a fresh t-shirt with his brown corduroy pants, and he was bouncing up and down in anticipation of playing with his cars. Edwin looked at David's rumpled bed and the zebra pajamas that lay crumpled on the floor next to it. As David started to skip past Edwin, who grabbed Edwin's shoulder, he pointed at the pajamas. "What have I told you?" Edwin asked. David looked up and to the right in his classic oops expression.
Sorry, Daddy.
He bent over and picked up the pajamas.
Always put things back in the closet, he said.
David opened the door leading to the next room and stowed his pajamas on the shelf next to a hanging rod of Edwin's clothing. Mimic watched David the whole time. For the next couple hours, Edwin was able to focus on work. But then, his focus was abruptly interrupted.
Look at me, Daddy,
David screamed. Edwin lifted his gaze from his task. His eyes widened. What do you think you're doing? He shouted. David, clad in one of the costumes sent by Fazbear Entertainment, was no longer a little boy. He was a yellow dog frolicking around on all fours. Because the costume was too big for David, the dog's limbs flopped all over the concrete. They were getting filthy. And it got worse. Next to David, Mimic was stuffed inside the top part of a green alligator costume. It, too, was now dirty. Edwin was going to have to clean up both costumes. Like he didn't already have enough to do. Those costumes aren't for play, Edwin yelled. He shot up out of his chair and charged over to his son, yanking David off the floor. He shook his index finger. Get out of that costume right now. He turned toward the Mimic. You too. David, predictably, started to cry. Edwin ignored the tantrum and worked on extracting his son from the faux fur. Once he had both child and robot costume free, Edwin placed Mimic next to one of the pillars. He pointed at David. Now go over there and play quietly. David sniveled. Okay, Daddy. Setting aside the costumes to deal with later, Edwin returned to his work. But he only got another half hour or so in before he was interrupted again.
Daddy, I'm hungry,
David announced when Edwin was right in the middle of doing a tricky soldering job. David poked Edwin in the forearm. Edwin's hand slipped. The solder blotched in the wrong place. Edwin swore. David, watch what you're doing. Edwin crossed his arms and glared at his son. You just made me mess something up and now I have to redo it. David looked at his feet. Edwin noticed Mimic gazing down at the bottom of his own legless torso.
Sorry, Daddy,
David said. Edwin took a deep breath and looked up at the ceiling's exposed old oak beams. He watched a spider toiling in the middle of its web, which was monstrous, over 3 feet wide. Anchored against one of the green pillars and stretching out to the top of one of the factory's tall, boarded-over windows, Edwin noted that the spider was alone, unhampered by spiderlings. The huge black insect was managing far more productivity than Edwin was. Edwin pulled his gaze from the spider and rolled his shoulders. He ruffled David's hair. It's okay, David, but could you please play quietly with Mimic for a bit longer while I finish what I'm doing here?
Okay,
David said. He turned toward the Mimic.
We'll draw.
A few days before, Edwin, while looking for a part on the 3rd floor, had come across a box of construction paper in a variety of colors. He'd carried the reams of paper down to the 1st floor and showed them to David. You can use these to draw whatever you want, Edwin had said.
Neato,
David had said. Since then, David and Mimic had been doing all manner of odd little drawings that were surrounded by markings that looked vaguely like hieroglyphics. When Edwin had asked David what they were, David shrugged.
It's made up.
It might have been made up, but it riveted David and Mimic, so now David pulled out more paper and he and Mimic began scribbling more drawings and symbols. Edwin, both amused and baffled by his son's creative efforts, turned back to his work. As Edwin finished the soldering job, he resolved to make time to tinker with Mimic after David was asleep later. This was something he'd been doing regularly since he'd created the Mimic. He kept tweaking Mimic's functionality so Mimic could do a better job at entertaining David. Clearly, however, it needed more work. As the rainy days continued, David was getting more and more restless. Perhaps if Mimic was a bit more mobile, Edwin thought. That night, after tucking David into his cot near Edwin's work table, and watching Mimic copy David's big yawn and the little eye rub that always preceded settling in with Tiger for sleep, Edwin picked up Mimic and carried him over to the long work table. There, he worked at updating Mimic's program so Mimic could use his arms and lower torso more fluidly. This new agility would give Mimic an expanded ability to play with David. Mimic would be able to scoot along the ground in approximation of the way David often butt-scooted across the floor he was playing on. He would also be able to get himself up and down stairs, and he'd be able to throw the ball farther and retrieve it as well. Edwin also adjusted Mimic's processors so that the Mimic could continue to execute more and more complex tasks. There, Edwin thought when he was done, that should give me some more time to focus on my work. And Edwin could do more while David slept too. Rubbing away his exhaustion, Edwin returned to the latest project he was doing for Fazbear Entertainment. He worked until just before dawn, and then he carried David, still sleeping, up to the apartment. There, Edwin dropped into bed himself and fell into a restless sleep. 2 hours later, Edwin awoke abruptly when his excited son landed on his stomach and screamed,
Sunshine! Daddy, let's play catch!
Trying to get back the breath that had been stolen from him when David's full weight had hit his solar plexus, Edwin blinked at the vivid yellow ray of sun that was streaking through the closet window, beneath the shade that Edwin hadn't bothered to lower the night before. David began bouncing up and down on Edwin's stomach. "David," Edwin shouted, "cut that out." David slid off his dad. Edwin took a deep breath to refill his lungs.
I'll go out and wait for you to come play,
David said. Edwin nodded vaguely, only half processing what David had said. Edwin sat up. As he put his feet on the floor, he heard David slide down to the factory's first floor. Good, Edwin thought. Mimic was down in the workshop. He'd keep David occupied while Edwin grabbed a quick shower and made breakfast. Edwin stood and headed toward the shower. He started thinking about how he was going to tackle the next part of his current project. Edwin was still thinking about his plans as he set out bowls and spoons, a box of cornflakes, and a carton of milk. He continued to strategize in his head as he trotted down the stairs to get his son. "David," Edwin called out as he got to the first floor. "Breakfast!" Edwin expected an immediate squeal of joy because David loved to eat, but he didn't hear anything. He did, however, feel something. The factory, as cool and dank as it was, didn't get a lot of air movement. Edwin never felt drafts, but he did now. He felt a strong current of warm air. Edwin's muscles tensed. In spite of the warmth that wafted across his bare arms, Edwin felt a chill skitter down his spine. Frowning, he looked around. Edwin's workshop looked as it should have. Mimic was sitting on Edwin's work table. Nothing was out of place. So why was Edwin on the alert? David, he tried again. This time his son's name came out louder, with just the slightest edge of fear. Edwin took a step forward, and that's when he saw the factory's main double doors were standing wide open. David, Edwin yelled. Edwin took off toward the open doorway, looking right and left past the pillars as he went, scanning the massive factory floor for his son. Edwin's stomach lurched into his chest. As Edwin dashed throughout the factory's open doors, he shouted for David again. Under the shout, he could hear his mind repeating over and over, "Please no, please no." He wasn't sure who or what it was his mind was talking to, but it didn't matter. The appeal wasn't heeded. The next 10 seconds of Edwin's life played out, as any normal 10 seconds would. They unfolded 1 second at a time. For Edwin, however, the next 10 seconds compacted into an expanded, infinite experience of horror that at once happened instantaneously and also went on forever. Edwin rushed out into the brilliant morning sun and breathed in a mouthful of humid air just as David's ball bounced out into the nearest lane of traffic. Oblivious of the oncoming white van, David, a wide grin on his eager face, his legs churning, dashed out onto the highway, his gaze locked on the bright red ball. Time compressed even more. Edwin could no longer process what he was seeing as a string of events. His mind shut down. All he had were his senses. The roar of an engine, the smell of exhaust, a blur of white skidding past Edwin's gaze, a screech of rubber on asphalt, the stench of burning rubber, the blur of white vibrating to a stop, a sickening thud, a scream, more screeching, and shouts. Edwin, as he streaked toward his son, tried to convince himself that what he'd just watched hadn't happened. He tried to tell himself David was fine, but he knew he was lying to himself. As he flew toward his son, Edwin knew he was running both towards something he'd never reach and away from something he'd never escape. "Call 911!" someone screamed. Edwin reached David's side. He bent over and tried to gather David into his arms, but another set of stronger arms pulled him back. "Don't move him," a man's voice said. Edwin lashed out, fighting to free himself. Everything lost focus. Edwin could only see flashes of color, crimson red spreading across an expanse of black, bright blue pressing down from overhead, snatches of white and orange and darker blue and yellow. Edwin opened his mouth, and he heard a high-pitched keen. The sound, he realized, was coming from him. The arms that gripped him held on even tighter. Edwin's senses failed him. The sounds faded into a distant roar. The colors blurred together. The sun was blotted out by a darkness that Edwin intuitively knew was coming from someplace within his soul. Out under the bright morning light in the road near his son's broken body, Edwin had lost his ability to process reality. But after that, he lost 2 weeks of his life entirely. He disappeared into a fugue he didn't even know was a fugue until he came out of it and realized that time had marched on after David had passed. Edwin had no memory of anything since that except the seemingly endless loop of David's death, which replayed in Edwin's mind-eye over and over again. Edwin came out of the lost moment of time one morning on a sunny day. Opening his eyes, Edwin found himself in his own bed, alone. Edwin blinked and rubbed his face. He struggled to get his mental bearings, and when he got them, he wished he hadn't. Although he couldn't remember any of the discrete details, Edwin had an intellectual understanding that he'd lived through burying his only son. He grasped that he was alone in the factory, and that life was supposed to be going on. Not sure he had the strength to stand, Edwin tried putting his feet on the floor and pushing himself off the bed. Amazingly, his legs held him up. They also took him to the bathroom and got him through a small morning routine, as if anything could be normal. As if anything would ever be normal again. When Edwin faced the mirror, he wasn't surprised to be looking into the eyes of a stranger. He didn't feel like Edwin anymore. Apparently he hadn't eaten much, if anything, during those last 2 weeks. The gaunt face of a broken man looked back at Edwin from the bathroom mirror. A scraggly beard was filling in around his full and now drooping mustache. Turning away from himself, Edwin left the bathroom. He headed toward the stairs and shuffled to his work table. There, his gaze landed on Mimic. I should deactivate him, Edwin thought. But Edwin didn't have the energy to do it. He barely had the energy to get to his work table. Drooping into his rolling chair, Edwin surveyed his current project. He'd been working on it, he realized, during the 2 weeks he couldn't remember living through. It was further along than it had been the day David had died, but Edwin had no memory of doing the work. And he had no desire to continue it now. But what choice did he have? His son was dead, but Edwin had obligations. Sighing, he bent over the work table and told himself to concentrate. Edwin picked up a pair of needle-nosed pliers. He looked at a tangle of wires and then gazed at the endoskeleton he was supposed to be merging with Fazbear Entertainment's latest costume, a blue bunny. Edwin frowned at the pliers. For the life of him, Edwin couldn't remember how to grip pliers. Did he use a fisted grip or a fingertips grip? He tried both. Neither felt right. A long scrape proceeded with a metal clunk. Edwin shifted his gaze from the pliers to the Mimic, who had just climbed up onto the table. Mimic clutched his makeshift tiger. Edwin stared at it, frowning. Slowly, a memory clawed its way through the murk that was his mind. In the recollection, Edwin was snatching David's tiger from Mimic's grasp. Mimic had tried to start carrying around the tiger. Edwin realized he'd blocked it out. Now he could remember squeezing Tiger, crying so hard that his tears soaked the tiger's fur. Edwin shook his head, willing the memory to go back where it had come from. Blankness was better than the jagged shards of scenes like that. Edwin glanced at Mimic. Don't you have something better to do than stare at me? Edwin grumbled. Mimic set aside his tiger and lifted both pieces of his pincers, forming one set into a bowl shape, and the other set into a makeshift spoon. Mimic mimicked, lifting the spoon to his mouth. The Mimic used its pincers to approximate the gesture of wiping ice cream from its chin. It was David's code for wanting ice cream. Seeing the Mimic use David's body language like this was too much for Edwin to process. He roared in fury and self-recrimination. Reaching out blindly, not knowing why he needed it, Edwin sought something to wield. He had a sudden, out-of-control imperative to hit, to destroy something. Edwin's hand closed over a length of metal, sharp-edged and cold. The metal was heavy. The weight of it felt good in Edwin's hand, so did lifting it, and so did bringing it down on the animatronic's head. Howling like a wild animal, Edwin battered Mimic over and over with the metal rod. Metal sparked against metal. The reverberation of each blow bounced up Edwin's arm, sending jabs of pain into his shoulder, but Edwin didn't care. He only cared about destroying Mimic, pulverizing the only real thing that Edwin could attack in an effort to annihilate his pain. Edwin pummeled Mimic again and again and again. He battered the animatronic's head, thrashed at his chest, and lashed at its arms. Edwin's swings were big and wide and wild. His muscles burned with the effort of pulling back the rod and arching it towards Mimic in one strike, and another after another. Edwin was panting, his chest heaving. The spittle that had shot from his mouth when he'd screamed at Mimic was now a froth that jetted from Edwin in great gushes. When his sputum landed on one of the Mimic's eyes, Edwin realized that the eye was dangling out of its socket, hanging against Mimic's cracked fake teeth. Edwin, who had been so lost in his rage that he'd been nearly blinded by it, blinked to clear his vision. That's when he saw how much damage he'd done. Mimic's eye wasn't the only thing out of place. The metal Edwin had used to form Mimic's forehead and jaw was crimped together, compressing Mimic's face. The broken teeth were shoved back into Mimic's head, caught up in torn and tangled wires. The remainder of Mimic's wiring had been raggedly wrested away from Mimic's metallic spine, and the spine itself was bent backward. Mimic's ribcage was crushed in multiple places, and Mimic's arms hung askew. Mimic's pincers were mutilated. Edwin was destroying his creation, but he didn't care. For 2 weeks, Edwin had been lost in a void of despair, and now his despair had turned into rage. He had to get it out somehow, or it would consume him, because Edwin knew, even as he continued to scream and foam at the mouth, that the real object of his anger was himself, and that infuriated him even more. He wanted to destroy himself, but he couldn't. So, he sublimated his wrath onto Mimic with an intensity he hadn't known he had in him. He lost control of his humanity. He was devolving into the primitive version of himself, into something ferocious and savage. He could almost feel his murderous thoughts pouring through his muscles and transfusing through the metal into Mimic's system. Edwin wasn't sure how long he wailed on Mimic before he finally ran out of strength and ran out of anger. Edwin's legs went out from under him. He collapsed to the ground and stared at the remains of his creation, the remains of his son's only friend. Mimic, though not completely destroyed, was now a pathetic picture of total defeat. At some point during Edwin's assault, Mimic had toppled over, and now he lay, arms bent, in one last tragic copy of Edwin's little boy. Edwin dropped his head into his hands. His anger dissolved into regret, and the regret brought tears that he thought might flow forever. Dominic put his hands against the peeling paint of the square brick building's double doors. He pushed, and the doors creaked. Beyond the doors, the feeble light of a sun attempting to squeeze a few rays past wispy gray clouds reached into darkness so heavy and complete that Dominic felt like he was looking not at the interior of a building, but rather at a solid black wall. Dominic hefted his heavy-duty tactical flashlight. Behind him, Harry's breath fell hot and moist against Dominic's shoulder blades.
"What do you see?"
Harry asked. Dominic flipped the light switch on his flashlight. He aimed the radiant beam through the doors. Glenn, who pressed against Dominic's left shoulder, sucked in a breath.
"What is that thing?"
he asked. Dominic, who'd felt his neck muscles tense when the flashlight beam landed on what looked like a huge, toothy behemoth, forced himself to get a grip.
"It's just some kind of loom, I think,"
he said.
From what I heard, this place was a lace factory before that Murray dude bought it. That thing is probably a lace-making machine. It's creepy, Glenn said.
Harry sidled out from behind Dominic. He chewed his lower lip and sniffled as he gazed in the direction of the flashlight's glow.
The whole place is creepy,
he said. A little guy, maybe 5'4" if he stood up real straight, which he rarely did, Harry had the courage of his stature, meaning not much at all. The only reason he was here was that he'd been ordered to be here, and even then, Harry had told Dominic he'd debated whether or not to quit this job, rather than take the assignment.
What are you afraid of?
Dominic had asked, resisting the urge to laugh at his friend.
I've heard stories,
Harry had said.
What stories?
Harry had shaken his head.
My mom says that talking about something gives it more power.
Dominic had snorted at this superstitious idea. Now, however, he wondered what Harry had heard. What was so bad that Harry didn't want to give it more power?
Are we just going to stand here like a bunch of scaredy cats? Glenn asked. Or are we going in?
Glenn flicked on his own flashlight. He gave Harry a pointed look, and Harry pulled a stubby flashlight from the pocket of his baggy khakis. He turned it on and squared his shoulders.
Alrighty then, Glenn said. Let's get this done so we can go back to my place and barbecue those ribs.
Harry turned and frowned at Glenn.
Ribs? I thought we were doing hot dogs. I hate ribs. They're so gory. They make me think of dead things.
Glenn rolled his eyes.
So are hot dogs.
Dominic decided someone had to take charge.
Okay, he said. Come on.
He stepped through the doors. Glenn and Harry followed Dominic. Together, all three walked into the darkness. Because Dominic and his friends were so wary, they shined their flashlights this way and that. The beams cut through the gloom like searchlights. The swooping beacons scythed over a dozen or so thick pillars that lined up precisely in 3 rows, equally spaced between the building's outer walls. The pillars' pale green paint was peeling. Under the paint, they were dingy, gray, and cracked.
This place sound?
Harry asked.
They wouldn't have sent us here if it wasn't, Dominic said. You sure?
Harry asked. A sudden whoosh of air rushed into the building. Dominic's long hair whipped around his face and got in his mouth. He was swiping it free when a deafening slam whirled him around. Dominic's flashlight beam landed on the now closed double doors. Harry, who had also rotated to face the doors, stared at them with wide eyes. His face, above the pale yellow of his flashlight's glow, looked ghostly white.
Boo!
Glenn yelled. Dominic flinched, but Harry nearly jumped out of his skin.
That's not funny,
Harry protested. Glenn laughed. Dominic couldn't help it, but he sniggered too. He patted Henry on his bony shoulder.
Come on, he said. Let's scope the place out and see what we're up against.
Harry swallowed hard and nodded. Dominic put his back to the closed door and also took a tentative step forward. Dominic hadn't been sure what to expect before they'd gotten here. The instructions they'd been given were vague, to say the least. Just get in there and clean up the mess. Make repairs and get it handled. Dominic's supervisor, Ron, had instructed when Dominic and his buddies got the assignment.
Get what handled?
Dominic had asked. Ron, a balding man with a beer belly, had waved a vague hand and said, Edwin Murray left that place in quite a state when he disappeared a few months ago. The property reverted to Fazbear Entertainment due to a breach of contract. Dominic didn't think that answered his question, but Ron hadn't said anything else. Dominic and his friends, therefore, now each carried a satchel. They had brought an array of tools. They were prepared, they hoped, for whatever the task might require. The only thing they'd known they'd need for sure was flashlights. "Take flashlights," Ron had told them. "The power's out in the building."
How come?
Harry said, fidgeting. "Paperwork mix-up with the power company," Ron had said. Harry's pale brows had bunched into a deep frown that still contorted in his face. In fact, now the frown was even deeper. Dominic couldn't blame Harry for his expression. Even Dominic, who wasn't easily spooked, was a little intimidated by the building. Dominic dropped his satchel on the floor, and it landed with a thud and several clanks as the tools inside jostled together. Glenn and Harry set down their bags as Dominic slowly arced his light through the room, squinting into the narrow beam and trying to see everything he could. Not that he was happy with what he was seeing. Besides the massive loom on the far wall of the big open space, the first floor of the 3-story building was pretty wide open. The floor looked to be flanked by 2 staircases. One was wide and steep. The other, hidden in the murk, appeared to be a secondary staircase partially hidden behind a wall. It was probably assigned to the people who'd worked here, Dominic thought. Throughout the open area, piles of lace lay in limp, dirty tangles at the base of several support pillars and against the exposed brick walls. To Dominic's left, a long work table was piled with wires and scrap metal, and what looked like robotic parts. A rolling stool sat near the table. Behind the table, a metal garment rack held a bunch of Fazbear character costumes. Dominic's flashlight glow picked out a brown Freddy Fazbear costume, a yellow Chica costume, a Foxy costume, a Bonnie costume, and a couple bright pink and yellow-green court jesters. A visible layer of dust lay like gray fuzz on all the costumes. Just past the row of costumes, a cot was set up. Its gray canvas sagged in the middle, as if someone heavy had been using it regularly. Dominic took a step forward and directed his flashlight beam at the concave depression in the center of the cot. Something was nestled there. What was it? It looked like a small, dingy, white animal. Dominic squinted. No, not an animal. It was just a bundle of lace. He laughed at himself for thinking he'd been looking at a tiger cub. Dominic turned and shined his light on the other side of the room. There, he saw a bunch of gears and metal rods scattered over the floor. Near them, countless spools of old, grungy thread were stacked on a warped wooden stand.
What's over there?
Harry asked. His voice, never particularly deep, was a little higher and breathier than usual. Dominic shifted the direction of his flashlight, so its illumination joined that of Harry's. The light reflected off something silvery and slanted.
Cool,
Glenn said, redirecting his flashlight to aim it in the same direction as the other two.
That looks like a slide. A slide?
Harry squeaked. Dominic, intrigued, walked forward past the 2 pillars. He found himself at the base of the secondary stairs. They were, as he'd suspected, plain and functional. They had, however, a feature he had not expected to see. Someone had attached a long metal slide to one wall of the staircase, so the stair treads were now only 18 or so inches wide. The slide covered the rest of the stairs' width. It ran from a landing above, one now obscured by the darkness, to the first level's concrete floor. A couple old lumpy mattresses covered the concrete at the base, as if to give a user of the slide a cushy place to land. But Dominic wouldn't want to land there now. In the beam of his light, he could see one of the mattresses. Something was inside of it, probably a rat. Dominic turned away and aimed his flashlight someplace else. The light landed in a shallow pool of water and reflected off a ripple along the puddle's surface. What had made the water ripple? Just an air current or something else?
What exactly is it we're supposed to be doing here? Glenn asked. I was hoping it would be obvious when we got here, Dominic said. But so far, he shrugged, your guess is as good as mine.
Harry, with uncharacteristic courage, walked over to the long work table.
Maybe we're supposed to finish Murray's projects and get them functional and then get him out of here. Could be, Dominic said. We should probably scope out the whole building before we jump to any conclusions. We should split up and explore, Glenn said.
Split up? Harry gasped.
It would speed things up, Glenn said.
Harry shook his head so emphatically that his blonde curls bounced around it. He blinked pale blue eyes several times. Not for the first time, Dominic was struck by how young Harry looked. Dominic knew Harry was actually 3 years older than Dominic's 24 years, but he didn't look it. His narrow chin, covered with little more than peach fuzz, Harry's stature wasn't the only thing that was stunted. Harry's features, dominated by large round eyes and a small nose that was perpetually stuffed up, were boyish. So was his nature. His brain, however, was advanced. Harry was an electronics and robotics whiz. That's why Fazbear Entertainment had hired him, and that was why he was on this team. Dominic had an engineering background, but he wasn't any kind of wonderkink. Neither was Glenn. His expertise was also in engineering, and his hobby was woodworking, so he was pretty handy to have around. Dominic and Glenn had something else in common. They both looked older than their years. This was so for Dominic because of the premature gray in his thick, wavy dark hair, and also because of his stark features. In addition, he had the kind of facial hair that needed shaving again 4 hours later. Dominic was also big, so was Glenn, although Glenn's size was more in his musculature than his height. Dominic was 6'4". Glenn was only 6 feet tall.
I'm not wandering around this place by myself, Harry said. Who knows what's even in here?
As if to punctuate the sentiment, a click and a faint scratching sound came from the opposite end of the first level. Dominic and his friends whipped their flashlight beams in that direction, just in time to watch a rat scurry out from behind the big, loom-like machine.
No way, Harry said. I'm not going anywhere in here alone.
Glenn began. Dominic spoke over the top of him.
That's fine, he said. I think we've seen what there is to see down here. There's just 2 more floors. Glenn, why don't you go up with Harry on the 3rd floor and check that out, and I'll take the 2nd one. Then we'll meet back down here and take stock of what we're facing.
Dominic looked at Harry.
That work for you?
Harry swallowed hard, but he nodded. Dominic looked at Glenn, who shrugged.
Whatever, he said.
All right, Dominic said.
Let's go.
Without waiting for his friends to respond, Dominic turned away from the secondary flight of stairs and started walking toward the main stairs. Although they were steep, they were wider. They also had what appeared to be a reasonably sound, black-wrought iron handrail climbing up the wall with them. Dominic's athletic shoes made a scuffling sound as he padded past the work table and circled around a pillar to get to the stairs. Behind him, Glenn's and Harry's footfalls echoed his own. Dominic paused at the base of the stairs and aimed his light up the steep flight. The light revealed that the wooden stairs had once been painted the same color as the pillars. The paint had mostly worn off, leaving dirty gray depressions between what little fading green paint remained at the stairs' edges. Not sure about the state of the wooden treads, Dominic hung on to the black stair rail as he tested the first step. The step had some give to it, and it groaned in protest of Dominic's weight, but it held. Dominic tentatively tried the second step. It was the same. He continued up the stairs. Glenn and Harry followed. On the second floor landing, all three men shined their flashlights down a narrow hallway. A series of doors and one open doorway were visible in the flashlight's beams. As one, the men turned and shined their lights up the next flight of stairs. Not as wide, but just as steep. The remainder of the stairs extended up toward the arched opening of an inky maw. Harry groaned.
Oh man, that's not good.
Glenn gave Harry a gentle punch.
Come on, it'll be an adventure. I don't like adventures,
Harry said, sounding like a whiny child, protesting his mother's attempt to get him to try something new. Glenn laughed.
Tough, come on.
Glenn pulled him up the stairs as Harry looked, forlornly, over his shoulder at Dominic, who gave Harry a thumbs up and then turned toward his own adventure. He wouldn't have admitted it, but Dominic wasn't too excited about his task either. Don't be a wuss, Dominic thought. He took a step down the narrow hallway. The first two doors were locked. He thought that was weird, but he decided not to worry about it at the moment. Better to explore what he could reach easily before he took on battering down a locked door. The third door led to a storeroom filled with boxes. Dominic opened one of the boxes and found robotic parts, circuitry, and wiring. Some gears, nuts, and bolts. In the second box, he found a robotic vacuum in its original packaging. The other boxes contained more of the same. The next room was filled with boxes as well. These were all sealed but labeled. The boxes were stacked to the ceiling. But Dominic read the labels. Fiona's hats, Fiona's shoes, bakeware, photo albums, games, puzzles, souvenirs, Edwin's photography equipment. Dominic stopped checking labels. These were apparently Murray's belongings. Dominic didn't know much about Edwin Murray, but he did know that his wife and kid had died. Poor guy. Fiona must have been his wife. The boxes were dingy and dusty and musty. Moisture had gotten to them. They were sagging. Probably much of their contents were damaged. All the packed up evidence of a guy's previously happy life was quite depressing. Dominic backed out of the room. So far, he hadn't found anything helpful, certainly nothing that Fazbear would want. Dominic continued on down the hall. In the next room, he found more boxes of Murray's belongings. Still, nothing interesting. In the room after that, however, things changed. Given the glass half wall at the edge of the next room Dominic entered, he concluded he was in one of the factory's old offices. This office, however, had been redone into a living space. It held an old-fashioned high-back sofa, like the kind of thing you'd see in an old mansion, and two wing-backed chairs. They'd probably been pale yellow at some point, but now they were a dirty tan. Heavy dust was layered on what looked like antique end tables and antique coffee tables. Dominic moved past the old furniture toward an opening on the far side of the room. Stepping through the opening, Dominic found himself in a small galley kitchen which was lined with yellow formica-covered counters, held a narrow fridge, a small 4-burner range, and one deep, off-white farm-style sink. At the end of the kitchen, a 2-person table was pushed up against the wall under a boarded window. Dominic looked at the window. For the first time, he thought about all the boarded-up windows. He knew the building had been empty for months, but why were all the windows covered with nailed-into-place plywood, both inside and out? It wasn't like this was a dangerous part of town, so it seemed a little weird. Dominic's nose twitched as he realized he was smelling rotting food, or something he hoped was rotting food. He aimed his flashlight around the tiny kitchen. The counters and the table were empty. But when Dominic's light whipped around, across the lower part of the refrigerator, he froze. He peered at a large reddish-brown stain on the dirty light blue linoleum. A stiff wire, partly silver and partly rust-colored, lay in the middle of that stain. Dominic took a step toward the fridge, and at the same instant, a rat crept out from the narrow crack between the fridge and the end of the counter. Later, Dominic muttered to himself. Dominic retraced his steps through the little living room and returned to the hallway. He poked his head through another door and shined his light around a tiny, gray-tiled bathroom with a clawfoot tub. He continued on. The next room Dominic came to was a large bedroom that held a dresser, a couple nightstands, a double bed, and a single bed that had been styled into a pretty impressive-looking white tiger. Dominic smiled, but then his smile faded. This bed must have belonged to Murray's kid. That was just plain sad. Dominic looked past the bed to a closed door. He took a step toward the door, but then his flashlight beam flitted past a set of narrow shelves. Piles of toys and a row of children's picture books filled the shelves. Both toys and books were shrouded in dust. And the books were limp, their spines blackened by mold. The building's moisture had taken its toll. Dominic started to step past the bookshelf, and then he spotted something on the shelves that didn't belong there. Dominic walked around the end of the tiger bed and aimed his light next to a row of plastic cars. The light landed on a satchel, not unlike the one Dominic, Glenn, and Harry had left on the first floor of the building. In fact, this satchel was identical to theirs. Given that Dominic's satchel and those of his friends were Fazbear Enterprise, Dominic had to conclude that this one must have been as well. Had there been another team assigned to handle things? Why hadn't that team finished this job yet? And why was their satchel still here? Dominic stepped forward and picked up the satchel. He sat down on the edge of the tiger bed and opened the leather case. Amid the expected tools, Dominic was taken aback when his flashlight beam landed on a small, battery-powered tape recorder. Curious, he picked it up and looked through it. The cassette tape in the recorder was stopped in the middle. Dominic pressed rewind to see if the recorder's battery was still good. It was. The tape began spinning, returning to its start with a purring whirl. When the tape was rewound, the recorder clicked off. The click felt unnaturally loud in the little room. Dominic shook off a shiver and shined his light around the room to be sure he was still alone, which made him feel like a first-class fool. He shook off the heebie-jeebies that suddenly set in for reasons he couldn't explain, and returned his attention to the recorder and pressed play. A shushing sound filled the room, followed by a crackle, then a man's voice. "I can't believe they sent us in here a week before Christmas," the man said. He sounded young, probably about Dominic's age. "Joan wants to kill me, and I don't blame her. We were supposed to decorate the tree with her nieces tonight, and instead I'm trapped in here. And what the hell is up with that?" Dominic stared at the recorder. Trapped? What did the guy mean by trapped? "Think we should pry the board off of the windows," the voice in the recorder continued. "But Tarrant says if we do that, we'll get fired. We're supposed to clean up a mess in here, not make another one," he says. "But seriously, we can't get out and go home with our families, and I don't get why the door locked so tightly to begin with. Why would it lock from the outside?" Dominic, his finger trembling ever so slightly, pressed the stop button on the recorder. He thought about the doors that had slammed shut behind him and his friends when they'd entered the building. He hadn't gone back to check the door. He'd assumed they'd just be able to get back out when they were ready. What if they couldn't? A faint whir and a tapping sound came from the hallway. Dominic stiffened and shined his light toward the door. It was empty. So was the hallway behind it. He didn't hear anything else. Dominic shifted position so he was facing the door. He pressed play on the recorder. A long sigh came from the recorder.
Okay, so I might as well document what we've done so far. For the record, I'm not about to get fired over this project. It's weird and it sucks, but we're doing our best.
The sound of rattling papers came from the recorder, then a cleared throat.
Terrence is the one who suggested we do what we've done,
the voice in the recorder said.
Because we weren't given real clear instructions on what to do.
We were pretty much at a loss at first. I mean, we're in an eerie building filled with old stuff and even older stuff. And what are we supposed to do with all this? Sort it? Catalog it?
Terrence says that because he's a tech guy, and I'm an engineer, we're probably expected to go through the boxes. He figured we're here to finish the projects Edwin was working on. So that's what we've been doing. We started a few hours ago, and we worked until past midnight. It's a good thing we have watches. With the windows all boarded up, we can't tell if it's day or night outside. I'm just glad we found the generator. Without it, we'd have to rely on our flashlights, and who knows how long those would have lasted.
Dominic stopped the recording again. Generator? Dominic stood, taking the tape recorder with him. He left the small bedroom. He'd check behind the door near the beds later. If there was a generator in this building, he wanted to find it. And he doubted it was in what he suspected was a closet. Dominic returned to the hall. The unmistakable sound of an engine powering up sent a rumble through the building. The bare light bulb over Dominic's head came on. He looked up and grinned, enjoying the ongoing thrum of the motor. Glenn and Harry must have found the generator.
Way to go, guys,
Dominic said. He turned off his flashlight. Even though the overhead bulb wasn't doing much to push back the shadows in the hallway, Dominic could see well enough, and he had a feeling he should conserve his batteries. Dominic looked up and down the hall. He figured he should continue to search this floor. Now that they had power, Glenn and Harry probably would do the same with the third floor. Dominic moved down the hall toward the next closed door. As he neared it, the same rotting smell he'd noticed in the kitchen returned. This time, though, the smell was more pronounced, and Dominic could tell what it was. He was smelling decayed flesh. Something nearby was definitely dead. A rat? Probably. Dominic looked at the closed door. Did he really want to go in there? He exhaled and shrugged, and opened the door. A bit of the hallway light bulb's weak light slipped in through the open doorway. Dominic pushed the door open wider, realizing that his shoulders were bunched up in anticipation of finding whatever was causing the foul odor. But all he saw when he looked into the room were 2 rows of hanging clothing and a shelf of folded clothing. He also saw another door. That door, he realized, led back to the bedroom he was just in. Clever. Murray had turned one of the factory's small storage rooms into a closet. Dominic wrinkled his nose. The smell was definitely stronger in here. It was probably just a dead animal, maybe behind one of the walls. Dominic backed away from the door and continued down the hall. For the next several minutes, Dominic explored the remainder of the factory's second floor. He found nothing but more storage rooms, most of which were empty, and 2 more office spaces. These hadn't been converted into a living space yet. They were stacked with old desks and chairs, and also some pretty cool vintage office equipment. He found a 1920s Underwood typewriter that he planned to take with him when the job was done. He was confident he could restore it, and he could envision it sitting on the shelf in his living room. The farther Dominic got from the little apartment area, the less he smelled the decay. The rooms on the far end of the hall smelled mildewy, but he didn't get a whiff of anything rotting, which was nice. Because power was running through the building again, he was able, at least, to get a bit of feeble lighting in each room. When he flipped the switches in some of the rooms, nothing happened, and then he'd pull out his flashlight for a quick inspection of each space. The increased illumination, however, had relaxed Dominic enough that he was comfortable turning the tape recorder back on while he explored. The man's voice, Dominic wished he knew the guy's name, kept Dominic company while he poked around.
The first thing we did, the man on the recorder said, was make a few repairs to the building. The roof had some pretty bad leaks, and we took care of the worst ones. At least for the short term. The old tin roof obviously needs to be completely redone, but we plugged things up the best we could. We also shored up a few steps and tackled some of the building's old wiring. We realized we had to do that when we got the generator going and still didn't have any light. There was a short in the system that was causing a cascade failure. We rerouted a few things and got the lights working in most of the rooms. The bulbs are old, though, and we couldn't find any replacements, so that's a short-term fix as well. Dominic reached the last room on the second floor. It was an old restroom. He tried the tap at one of the sinks, and no water came out. The stall doors were closed. Beneath the old wood panels, darkness puddled. Dominic didn't see the point in looking into the stalls, and he wasn't keen on doing it anyway, especially after he thought he saw a movement in the blackness under one of the doors. More rats, he figured. No need to deal with that. Dominic swiftly left the restroom and headed back down the hall. The man on the recorder continued to talk. Assess the condition of the endoskeletons we found on the near work table. Some were in early stages and needed a lot of work, but some just needed some adjustments, so we went ahead and did that. Also, after we take a break and share Terrence's protein bar, we're going to go ahead and complete a pretty cool endoskeleton. From the waist up, it looks like it should be functional, but it's not moving. The man snorted, and no wonder. It doesn't have any legs, so we're going to take some legs off one of the nearby non-functional animatronics and add them to the more advanced one. The tape recorder clicked off just as Dominic made it back to the main staircase. From the floor above, he heard a heavy thud. Then he heard a murmur of voices and clomping footsteps coming down the stairs. While he waited for Glenn and Harry to join him, Dominic took the tape out of the recorder, flipped it over, and reinserted it, and hit the play button. He listened to the whisper purr of the tape looping around, but no other sound came out of the machine. Dominic fast-forwarded the tape and hit play. Again, still nothing. That was too bad. He wanted to know more about this other team. Dominic stared at the recorder. Why had the recorder's owner left it behind? Dominic felt the skin on the back of his neck prickle as an unwelcome thought crept up from his subconscious.
I wasn't seeing things,
Harry said as Glenn and Harry reached the second level.
Sure you were, Glenn said. You're spooked and it's messing with your head.
It's not,
Harry insisted.
It is too,
Glenn said. Dominic cocked his head and studied his buddies.
Are we back in kindergarten?
He asked.
What's going on?
Glenn rolled his eyes.
Nothing's going on. Harry thought he saw something move up on the third floor.
I did,
Harry said.
What's up there?
Dominic asked. Bunch of junk, Glenn said. Boxes of thread and machine parts. Old furniture, sometimes lumber. A mess of half-finished inventions. Not sure what most of them were supposed to be. Weird machines. The whole floor is an open space stuffed with old stuff. And a generator, Dominic said, pointing at the faint yellow light coming from the bulb over their heads. Yeah, a generator, Glenn said. He clapped Harry on the back. I thought it was a lost cause when we found it, but Genius here got it going. Harry shrugged and chewed on his thumbnail.
It's not going to run for very long,
Glenn said.
There's not much gas left in it.
How long? Dominic asked.
Maybe a couple hours,
Harry said.
I think we should call it quits for the day,
Glenn said.
We can get some cans of gas and some light bulbs. Most of the bulbs up there are on. But they're on their last legs, like that one.
He pointed over his head.
We can come back tomorrow.
I hope we can, Dominic said.
What does that mean?
Glenn said.
What did you find?
Glenn looked down the hall. He put the back of his large, knuckled hand to his nose.
And what is that smell? I got a whiff of it as we passed this level, and I didn't think much of it, but now that I'm down here...
He contorted his puffy features. The bags under his eyes pleated, and his round cheeks expanded as he blew out air.
That's rank.
Harry sniffed.
I don't smell anything. You never do.
Glenn said. He turned toward Dominic.
Seriously, did you find a dead animal or something?
Glenn's eyes were suddenly jittery, and the ruddy skin around his nose was tight. Dominic shook his head.
It must be behind an old wall or something.
He moved toward the stairs.
Come on, let's head back downstairs, and I'll tell you what I found.
Glenn looked down the hall and frowned, then he shrugged.
Yeah, okay.
As Dominic led Glenn and Harry down the sagging old steps, Dominic relayed what he'd found. He also explained what he'd heard on the tape.
Trapped?
Harry yelled as they reached the main level.
Another team?
Glenn said.
Why didn't Ron tell us about them?
I plan to ask him, Dominic said. Together, the three men strode past the main level's support pillars, although still filled with darkened corners and relentless half-light. The factory floor was at least now illuminated by flickering bulbs and several dust-coated black metal warehouse pendant lights. The lights, rather than lowering the freak factor of the factory, added to it. The intermittent gleam accentuated the cavernous feel of the place. Dominic couldn't wait to leave. He and the others headed towards the closed double doors. There, however, they discovered that, like the other team, they too were stuck in the building.
There has to be another way out,
Harry said breathily after they'd done everything they could think of to get the doors open.
Why didn't we bring an axe or a chainsaw?
Glenn asked, only half sarcastically.
There has to be another way out,
Harry repeated. But there wasn't. When they'd explored the main level before, Dominic and the others hadn't been looking for doors leading outside. Now they did look for those doors, and they didn't find any.
What kind of factory has just one set of doors?
Glenn asked when they finished examining the perimeter of the first level.
That is a good question,
Dominic thought. But this one didn't. He thought he could make out where two other doors used to be. Two door-sized sections of brick looked newer. They were redder instead of the more faded and pink ones of the factory's walls. Dominic, Glenn, and Harry gathered next to the long work table.
What now?
Dominic asked.
I don't suppose there was a balcony or a fire escape on the third floor.
Glenn shook his head.
Nah, nothing. But boarded up windows. Just like down here.
Harry let out a gasp.
What?
Glenn said, obviously exasperated. Harry lifted a shaky finger and pointed at the garment rack behind the work table.
Weren't there 2 court jester costumes when we first got up here?
Glenn frowned and looked toward the row of costumes.
Who knows? It's not like we could see much with just our flashlights.
Dominic studied the costumes. Instead of hiding shadows as they had been when Dominic looked at them earlier, the costumes were illuminated by one of the hanging pendant lights. Dominic frowned. Had there been a second jester costume? He thought there had been, but there wasn't now. And since he and Glenn and Harry were the only ones in here, Dominic must be remembering wrong.
There were 2,
Harry whispered.
I noticed stuff like that.
Glenn and Dominic exchanged a look. Dominic noticed a vein near Glenn's temple was pulsing visibly. Glenn cleared his throat.
I hate to say this, but I think we need to go back up to the second floor and figure out what's causing that smell.
Dominic's chest tightened.
Why?
He asked, although he knew the answer. Glenn shook his head.
I've smelled something like that one other time, and, well, let's just say I'm not so sure it's a dead animal up there. What do you mean?
Harry squeaked. Glenn ignored Harry and looked at Dominic. Dominic thought about the stain he saw in front of the refrigerator.
I think you're right,
he said to Glenn. Dominic pulled up the top of his t-shirt and breathed through it as he and Glenn stared at what they'd found inside the refrigerator. He tried to block out the disgusting sound of Harry vomiting onto the linoleum behind him. The sour stench of Harry's stomach contents merged with the sickly sweet smell of decaying flesh. Glenn lifted a foot and used it to push the refrigerator door closed. He turned away and strode out of the kitchen. Harry, wiping his mouth, stumbled after Glenn. Dominic, his legs unsteady, followed the others. Why hadn't he opened the refrigerator door earlier? He'd seen the stain, and he'd known what it was. Even in the mottled light his flashlight was capable of producing, he could recognize a bloodstain when he saw one. But he'd used the rat excuse as an excuse not to listen to the little voice in his head that had been nagging at him ever since he'd gotten the first whiff of what he thought was rotting flesh. Had he, on some strange level, known what was truly inside the refrigerator? No. How could he have known? Dominic's mind replayed in vivid detail what he'd just seen. As it did, his stomach heaved. He didn't begrudge Harry for throwing up. Dominic wondered if the man who had been broken down and compressed like a compacted doll before being crammed into the fridge was the same man who made this tape recording. Or was it Terrence? Or maybe someone else? Whoever it was had been garroted so violently that he was nearly decapitated. Then his limbs had been snapped and crimped so his entire body could fit neatly inside the fridge. Glenn stopped in the hallway and looked farther down the hall. He inhaled and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he caught Dominic's gaze.
You're thinking what I'm thinking, right?
Dominic thought about how strong the smell was in the makeshift closet. He also thought about how many parts of that closet lay in darkness, and how he hadn't bothered to check to see what else it might hold. He nodded.
Yeah.
What?
Harry asked. He clutched at his stomach. His face was white and taut. His legs wobbled, and he started to sway. Glenn gave Harry a uncharacteristically gentle pat and helped Harry sit down on the top of the staircase.
You wait here.
Harry didn't answer. Now seated, he leaned over and put his head between his knees. Glenn looked at Dominic. Dominic nodded. "Follow me," he said. It took only seconds to reach the door that opened into the room Murray and his son had used as a closet. And it took just another second to flip the light switch by the door. Why hadn't Dominic turned on the light when he'd looked earlier? Probably because of that, he thought, when he saw the body hanging among the clothing that was stored on the rod running along the back wall.
Oh man,
Glenn breathed. That's just... He shook his head, but he didn't run away from what they'd found. Dominic couldn't look away either. In the gloom that had filled this room when he looked earlier, the man, stowed tidily among a row of men's suits, could have passed, at a glance, for more clothing. Even in the unsteady light of the room's fading bulb, though, it was clear that the clothing was on a corpse, and the corpse was caught up on a hanger. A metal rod was speared through the corpse's chest, running left to right, and the rod had been wired into a wooden suit hanger. The man hung upright from the hanger, like a side of beef dangling on a meat hook.
Oh, geez, Glenn said. He's been eviscerated.
Dominic dropped his gaze to the corpse's midsection. He put a hand over his mouth. What he'd first thought were just wrinkles in the man's jeans were actually entrails slopping over his belt.
Do you think that's...
Glenn began. His question was cut off by the sound of Harry's shrill scream. As one, Dominic and Glenn whirled around and looked down the hall. At first, Dominic wasn't sure what he was seeing when he gazed toward the top of the steps. Maybe his brain, not accustomed to witnessing such things, refused to process it. Maybe he was in shock. Maybe he was in denial. Whatever caused his initial confusion abated quickly as Dominic faced the fact of what he was witnessing. He also faced the fact there was nothing he could do to stop it. Before Dominic could even think about moving, Harry was dead. And the court jester, not a real jester obviously, but a bright pink and yellow-green court jester costume with a wide leering grin, something in a grinning jester costume, was pulling Harry's brain out of the top of Harry's open skull. Harry was dead. He had to be. But he was still sitting upright, as whatever was in the jester costume scooped the grayish, beige, pulpy lump out of Harry's head, as if the jester wasn't a jester at all, but rather a bear pulling honey from a beehive. Harry's lifeless torso collapsed, and his body tumbled forward onto the stairs with a whump. The jester, brain in the costume jester's hand, turned and aimed his creepy huge smile directly at Dominic. Dominic couldn't move. Glenn grabbed his arm. "Come on!" Glenn shouted. Dominic let Glenn drag him backward along the hall. Dominic's legs were jelly, and he was having trouble breathing, but he was able to stay with Glenn as Glenn rushed them down the hall toward the secondary flight of stairs. Dominic's head, which he realized was filled with a roaring sound as if his shock was a waterfall thundering through his consciousness and wiping out any semblance of reason or functionality, managed to grasp onto a coherent thought. The slide, he remembered. They reached the slide just seconds after Harry's body landed on the main staircase treads. Glenn manhandled Dominic into a sitting position on the top of the slide. He planted a hand between Dominic's shoulder blades and gave Dominic a shove. "I'm right behind you," Glenn said as Dominic started down the slide. Indeed, Dominic could feel Glenn's oversized work boots against his back as he skimmed down the slide. When he landed on the lumpy, filthy, moist mattress on the first floor, Glenn landed almost simultaneously with him. Glenn was on his feet in half a second. He reached down and took Dominic's hand, pulling him up. Glenn looked right and left. "We need a place to hide," he whispered. His gaze snapped back and forth between the top of the slide and the bottom of the staircase. Dominic, now starting to think more clearly again, nodded. Unfortunately, the main floor didn't have a lot of hiding places. He pointed toward the big loom machine. "Maybe under the lace over there behind the machine," he suggested. Glenn nodded sharply. "Good a place as any." Dominic took the lead this time, moving as quietly as he could. He ducked behind the nearest pillar and then hurried across the 20 feet or so that lay between the pillar and the machine. Checking over his shoulder to be sure they weren't being observed by anything, Dominic dove under a rotting pile of lace. Glenn, again, was right behind him. Together, they huddled under the limp material. The lace was fetid. Dominic began breathing through his mouth. From the noisy inhales and exhales in Dominic's ear, it was clear Glenn was doing the same. For probably a full minute, Dominic and Glenn breathed in silence. Dominic didn't want to talk. He was trying to hear through their panting and respiration. He was listening for footfalls. Eventually, the sounds of labored breathing turned into quieter, quick puffs. They were calming, marginally. Still, Dominic couldn't hear anything. Dominic, who couldn't see anything through the lace anyway, closed his eyes. He needed to think. Harry had been right, Dominic realized. There had been a missing jester costume, but who, or what, was inside it? Dominic badly wanted to get Glenn's take on what was going on, but he knew better than to make any sound. Since they couldn't get out, they had to stay hidden and quiet. Dominic wouldn't have believed it was possible, but he fell asleep under the skin-crawlingly disgusting lace. He closed his eyes and lost consciousness. He was only aware of this fact, though, when Glenn elbowed Dominic and then clawed his way free of the lace. Dominic blinked several times, remembered where he was, and hissed, "What are you doing?" Glenn extracted himself from the frilly material. He wiped cobwebs from his eyes.
"Don't worry,"
Glenn said.
"Whatever it is isn't down here. I've been listening for a while and I haven't heard a thing."
Dominic frowned, not convinced. He looked around. Everything looked the same as it had when they'd headed toward the doors, expecting to leave.
"We need a weapon,"
Glenn said. Dominic nodded. He wanted to ask what kind of weapon could stop something that could lop off the top of a man's head, but he didn't say anything.
"All I have is my toolbox. That could work. I got a wire cutter and a wrench, but it's not a big one,"
Glenn said.
"Anything in your toolbox that would work?"
Dominic shook his head. His tools were designed for intricate work, not for fighting off a serial killer.
"Maybe on the work table,"
Glenn said. Dominic nodded again. It wasn't normal for Glenn to take charge, but Dominic was okay with it. He was out of his depth. Their heads swiveling constantly, alert for any sign of danger, Dominic and Glenn crossed the factory floor to the work table. They began searching the area for something they could use as a weapon.
"You realize what's going on, don't you?"
Glenn said. Dominic frowned. Did he? Probably. But he kept silent. He waited for Glenn to answer.
"Fazbear Entertainment is trying to clean up a mess,"
Glenn said.
"Then sent in a team to do that. Team A, let's call them. They failed."
Understatement, Dominic muttered. In spite of the situation, Glenn forced a chuckle.
"Yeah, so we're Team B, and we're either going to stop whatever killed those other guys,
And killed... Glenn's voice caught. He cleared his throat.
Poor Harry,"
He said. He cleared his throat even louder.
"Anyway, either we stop whatever's in that costume, or we're going to be sealed up in here just like everyone else."
That's what I was thinking, Dominic said. But his mind wasn't on the conversation. Dominic had just spotted something lying under the work table. Something that shot ice water through his veins. He froze as he gazed at the discarded, bloodied court jester costume that lay under the work table. Dominic sucked in his breath sharply.
"What?"
Glenn said. Dominic straightened. I think that was as far as he got, because as he spoke, Glenn walked around to the far side of the work table. When Glenn brushed past the costume hanging on the garment rack, he didn't notice the movement of a fuchsia and white mushroom costume with gaping round dark eyes and an O-shaped, cavernous mouth. "Glenn," Dominic shouted, "look out!" Glenn didn't bother to turn around and find out what Dominic had seen. Wisely, he just started to run. But it didn't make any difference. The mushroom man, or whatever it was, had faster reflexes than Glenn did. Before Glenn could even take a step, the mushroom man's hand caught Glenn by the back of his shirt collar. Glenn flailed, but his efforts weren't enough. The mushroom man's other hand grabbed the back of Glenn's brown leather belt. Then, in a motion so fast Dominic could barely follow it, the mushroom man lifted Glenn off the ground and held him belly down, back up, for an instant, before taking one long stride and ramming Glenn head first into the brick wall behind the garment rack. Whoever wore the Mushroom Man costume had superhuman strength. Glenn's head cracked against the brick and was instantly pulverized like a smashed watermelon. The crushed head, still attached to Glenn's spine, was driven into his neck, and then Glenn's shoulders coordinated into the wall. Glenn was shredded tissue and mangled bone from the ridge cage up. When the mushroom let go of Glenn's belt and dropped the corpse, which was now basically just legs, onto the concrete, that was when Dominic's brain finally got a message to his feet. He turned and ran. Dominic burst onto the top level of the factory. He looked around wildly. The factory's third floor was like his grandma's attic on steroids. Over 1,500 square feet or so of brick-walled, cement-floored open space was crammed full of everything, from basic cardboard boxes, to wooden crates, to old furniture, to bolts of lace, to stacks of character costumes, which were similar to the ones they'd found on the first floor, to mounds of unidentifiable machinery. Dominic felt like he'd walked into a musty, filthy flea market. Everything that stretched out before him was covered in dust and wilting from the moisture of the air. On the far side of the expanse, the generator grumbled and chugged. Even over the racket, Dominic could hear something nearby, probably another leak in the roof. Hopefully. Dominic couldn't see the generator from where he stood. He'd have to check it out, but for now, it sounded steady enough. Dominic had no way to get out of the building. At least, not that he could think of at the moment. He thought the only way he could survive was to hide long enough for someone from Fazbear Entertainment to come and look into the status of his team. Although, if he was being honest with himself, he wasn't sure anyone would actually come and check. And if they did, it wouldn't be soon. Terrence and the unnamed man in the tape recorder had been here a month earlier. And clearly no one had come in since then. Dominic had a candy bar in his satchel, but that was it. And if the other faucets were as dry as the one he'd checked, he had no water unless he counted whatever was dripping through the roof. Dominic wasn't going to last a month. But would he even survive long enough to have the chance to last? Dominic scanned the shadows on the stairway. He was alone, but for how long?
You could fight,
Dominic muttered. Yeah, he thought, he could fight, and he had to fight, trying to wait out whatever wore the costume wasn't an option. Dominic, of course, understood that whatever he was up against wasn't something easily defeated like a man in a suit. Whatever he was facing was much more than a mere man. It was a monster, probably a robotic monster, but not necessarily. No matter what it was, however, there had to be a way to stop it. Dominic looked at the jumble of machines. Maybe there was something he could use. He looked up and down the hall, and finally made a decision. Dominic dashed into the apartment's bedroom because he'd lost his flashlight long before Glenn was killed. So he had to flick on the bedroom light to spot the satchel. As soon as he did, he hurtled around the tiger bed, grabbed the satchel, and retreated from the room faster than he'd entered it. No longer caring about being quiet, fully unglued and wanting to be back on the third level where his potential monster-killing machine waited for him, Dominic tore back out into the hallway and galloped up the stairs to the third floor. At the top of the steps, Dominic stopped and bent over to catch his breath. He clutched the satchel's handle like it was a lifeline. Now that he had some tools, he was confident he could build something to stop the costume-wearing killing machine. All he needed was a little time to think. But time wasn't something he was going to get. Before Dominic could even take one step toward the machinery, the top costume in the pile of costumes near one of the wooden crates sat up. The costume, its faux fur, matted and rotting, was a grayish-purple lion with a bedraggled mane and broken whiskers. The costume's decrepit appearance, however, did nothing to diminish the horror as it rose up from the pile and took a step forward. Dominic whirled and lunged toward the stairs. He didn't make it to the first tread. The lion thing that caught Dominic caught him by the ankle just as he was about to descend the stairs. Dominic's feet went out from under him. He fell face first, and his chin hit one of the hardwood treads. Dominic cried out, but the impact of his chin was just the beginning of his discomfort. Yanked backward roughly, thudding up the stairs, Dominic was spun onto his back and slammed to the floor. The impact vibrated through his entire skeletal system, and the pain was intense. But again, that pain was nothing. A fireball of agony tore up through his midsection, starting at his solar plexus between his ribs. The torture seared up through his chest and grabbed him by the throat from the inside. It felt like a band of molten metal was choking him from within. Dominic looked down, and he immediately opened his mouth to scream. However, nothing came out. This was because the thing in the lion suit had reached up through Dominic's solar plexus and grabbed his trachea from the inside. The lion was now yanking his trachea back down through his chest. Dominic's heart, hammering impossibly fast, exploded in his chest. He fought for breath, but couldn't find it. He reached for a coherent thought, but he couldn't grab that either. Instead, Dominic could do nothing but give in to the darkness that mercifully smothered the fiery torment, ripping him apart from the inside out. Yay, subscribe.